The gavel slammed down like a gunshot. Marble walls echoed in the federal courtroom as all eyes turned to the solitary figure standing in the piece's center, stone still, silent, unblinking. The tomb guard stood in full ceremonial uniform, perfectly composed as if carved from the same marble pillars that surrounded him. His white-gloved hands rested on the hilt of his ceremonial rifle, boots polished to a mirror's glare. The judge leaned forward from his high bench, lips curled in a mocking half-smile. "Well," he drawled, voice dripping with disdain, "are you going to speak, or just stand there like a statue in uniform?" A ripple of laughter broke from the courtroom gallery. Reporters chuckled behind raised notepads, their cameras poised for the moment they'd been promised. A few interns stifled giggles behind their hands. Somewhere in the back, a child snorted and whispered, "He's not even real." But then something subtle shifted. Two elderly veterans in the gallery stiffened, jaws set, their eyes narrowed, not at the guard, but at the judge. The air changed. The laughter faltered, fractured, then faded as though shame itself had swept through the room. The guard did not move. He did not blink. He did not flinch. His gaze stayed locked on the empty air ahead of him, past the judge, past the audience, past the world. A stillness so sharp it sliced through the noise like a blade. The judge's smile twitched. "Nothing to say for yourself? Not even one word?" He pressed, his voice louder now, filling the chamber as if to drown out the silence. Still nothing. The photographers leaned in, cameras flashing. The veterans rose slowly to their feet, hats removed, spines straight, and for the first time all morning, the courtroom grew completely still. Someone in the press row swallowed hard. A shiver moved through the gallery like a passing shadow. It felt as if the room itself was holding its breath. The crowd thought he would bow. The narrator's voice will echo in your viewer's mind. But in the next breath, the world saw what honor truly means. The judge shifted in his chair, eyes flicking nervously to the guard's unmoving figure, and for a fleeting, flickering moment, his arrogance cracked. Because the silence wasn't weakness. It was warning. And though no one yet knew it, the storm was already coming. The silence inside the courtroom carried an entire lifetime behind it, because the man standing at attention in that pressed, ceremonial uniform was not just a guard. He was once a soldier. The guard's past his name was Sergeant Daniel Hayes. 10 years earlier, he had crouched behind a crumbling wall of stone and dust halfway across the world, cradling his best friend as mortar thundered overhead. Corporal Ryan Cole had been 19, a kid who wrote his sister every Sunday, who talked about opening a barbecue joint back home. They'd been ordered to hold the line, and they did, until the blast hit. Hayes had woken in a field hospital, hearing two things before the morphine pulled him under: that Cole was gone, and that the flag they were protecting never touched the ground. For months after, Hayes drifted, eyes hollow, nights sleepless, every sudden sound a trigger. His world had turned gray, until one morning, limping through Arlington Cemetery with a cane and a heavy heart, he saw them, tomb guards, pacing in perfect silence before the tomb of the unknown soldier, every step precise, every turn sharp, every motion a wordless oath. They weren't guarding a person. They were guarding everyone, every soldier who never came home, every name that would never be known. Hayes stopped walking. He stood there for hours, long after the tourists had left, watching the final guard vanish into the barracks at sunset. Something inside him shifted. For the first time since the war, his mind was still. The next day, he applied. It took him 14 months to earn the badge. 80% of candidates washed out from exhaustion, from the pressure, from the sheer weight of the silence. But Hayes endured. He carried the weight like it was Ryan Cole's name stitched to his heart. And every dawn since, he had taken his post with one vow: stand for them, never falter, not even for an instant. The judge's rise across the courtroom. Judge Victor Caro had built a very different kind of life. He wasn't shaped by war. He was shaped by ambition. Caro had risen fast, Ivy League degrees, sharp suits, and sharper words. He was the kind of man who believed traditions were just old theater for sentimental fools. He thrived on spectacle, on being quoted, on being seen. Every ruling he gave was a performance. Every decision was part of a future campaign speech he hadn't written yet. To him, the tomb guards were relics, stoic mannequins. He had called them once in a televised debate, smirking as the studio audience laughed. He believed the world belonged to the loud, the clever, the ones willing to break the old rules. And when he learned that a guard had refused to move, speak, or acknowledge a disruptive protester during a public ceremony, even as chaos unfolded around him, Caro saw an opportunity. He framed it as dereliction and summoned Hayes to answer for it in court. But beneath the legal veneer was something darker. He wanted to break the silence, to prove that even the most disciplined symbol of tradition could crack under his voice. Caro had invited the media. He had filled the gallery with reporters, law students, and donors. This was never just a hearing, it was theater, and he was certain he would be the star, the symbolic battleground. Yet, the setting was working against him from the start. The courtroom was built like a cathedral of stone, towering marble columns, an arched ceiling painted with the scales of justice, flags standing sentinel behind the bench. The walls seemed to hum with history. To most, it was just a building. To Hayes, it felt like enemy ground, a place where words were weapons and silence was considered weakness. But he had faced worse terrain before, and something about standing on polished marble reminded him of standing on the marble steps at Arlington, in the early gray before the world woke. There too, the air was heavy with ghosts and duty. He did not fear this place. He only feared failing the vow he carried for those who never came home. So, while Judge Caro swept in with cameras following like moths to a flame, Hayes had entered the courtroom before dawn. Alone, quiet, he had stood in the empty chamber in full dress uniform, boots lined edge perfect, gloved hands resting on the hilt of his ceremonial rifle. He had closed his eyes, and whispered once, so faint it barely stirred the air, "Stand for them." The crowd by the time the hearing began. The courtroom was packed shoulder to shoulder. On the right side sat a row of schoolchildren on a field trip, wide-eyed and buzzing with whispers. Behind them, their teacher clutched her itinerary nervously, not sure this was appropriate. To the left, a cluster of aging veterans in pressed blazers sat stiff-backed, American flag pins shining on their lapels. One had lost a leg, another had lost his son. The press gallery hummed like an electric hive, pens tapping, cameras prepped, eyes glinting with the anticipation of a headline. Every seat was full, every face eager to see something crack. And in the center, surrounded by the restless buzz of modern chaos, stood Sergeant Hayes, motionless, unflinching, like a monument planted in the present. Carrying the weight of the past, Judge Caro didn't see a man. He saw a prop, a mute backdrop for his own spotlight. What he did not see, what none of them saw, was the storm buried under that silence. The years of pain welded into discipline, the memory of a dying friend whispering, "Don't let go of the flag." Caro thought this was just a trial, but for Hayes, it was sacred ground, and he would not let it be desecrated. The first strike, words as weapons. Caro leaned forward on his bench, fingertips steepled, his tone dripping with false courtesy. "Sergeant Hayes," he began, savoring the military title like a bitter taste on his tongue. "Do you know where you are right now?" Hayes didn't flinch. His gaze stayed locked on the empty space ahead, precisely 3 inches above the judge's head, the same place his training taught him to look when standing post. The judge smiled thinly. "This is not Arlington," Caro continued. "This is a court of law. Here men speak. They answer questions. They acknowledge authority. They don't play mannequin." The press gallery chuckled softly. Camera shutters clicked like insects. The schoolchildren exchanged grins, but the veterans in the back row did not move. Their faces were carved from stone, jaws clenched, eyes hard. Hayes remained silent. Caro raised his brows, spreading his hands in mock sympathy. "Cat got your tongue, Sergeant? Or is silence just easier than accountability?" The words hit like pebbles against a fortress wall. Hayes did not blink. The judge turns the crowd. Caro rose from his bench with theatrical slowness, robes billowing like black sails. He began to circle the witness stand where Hayes stood, pacing as he spoke, the predator walking laps around his prey. "Let's review what happened, shall we?" he said, voice booming through the marble chamber. "On the afternoon of June 14th, you were on duty at the tomb of the unknown soldier. A protester breached the barrier, shouted at you, waved a banner inches from your face." He stopped, spinning to face the audience. "And what did our honored guard do?" "Nothing, not a single reaction." He stood there while chaos brewed around him, while officers scrambled, while children cried. The schoolchildren in the gallery shifted uncomfortably at that. One of the veterans' jaws flexed. Caro turned on Hayes again, eyes glinting like polished glass. "You stood there like a marble statue while others risked themselves to secure the scene. Why, did you think you were too sacred to move?" Nothing. Hayes's posture did not waver. The rifle's chrome gleamed under the skylight like frozen lightning. Caro spread his arms toward the audience. "Do you see this? This performance of silence? This is what passes for honor now. An empty suit of tradition, too proud to act, too hollow to speak." A ripple of uneasy laughter slipped through the press row. The veteran stayed utterly still, and for the first time, A strange tension began creeping around the edges of the crowd like cold air leaking into a warm room. Camera, flashes and cracks. In composure, a photographer in the front row leaned forward and snapped a photo. Flash. Hayes didn't blink. Another leaned in from the side. Flash. The light burst against his eyes like a miniature sun. Still nothing. Caro began pacing closer, like a vulture circling carrion. Tell me, Sergeant, he pressed, voice sharp as a chisel. When exactly did you forget how to be human? Was it before or after you decided rules don't apply to you? His words hit with theatrical venom, each one calculated to provoke. Hayes breathed in once, slow and silent. The only movement in his entire frame was the almost imperceptible rise of his chest. The veterans saw it. The judge didn't. Caro sneered. Perhaps you think silence makes you stronger, makes you untouchable. But it doesn't. It makes you irrelevant. It makes you judge. One of the veterans barked suddenly, rising halfway from his seat. His voice cracked through the chamber like a rifle shot. Caro froze, startled. The veteran's voice shook with barely bridled rage. That man has stood longer in one shift than most men stand in their entire lives. He doesn't owe you words. Gasps rippled through the room. A marshal moved quickly to hush the interruption, guiding the veteran back to his seat. But the damage was done. For the first time, Caro's performance faltered. He blinked. Hayes did not, eroding the atmosphere. Caro recovered fast. His smile slithered back. Thank you, sir, he said with false grace. Your passion is noted. Noted, but here, passion is not proof. Silence is not sanctity. And this court will not be cowed by theatrics. He turned on Hayes again, voice like ice. And neither will I. The temperature in the courtroom seemed to drop. A nervous cough echoed from the schoolchildren's row. The reporters shifted in their seats, tension scratching across their faces. Hayes remained utterly, impossibly still. The ceremonial badge on his chest, the Silver Tomb Guard identification badge, one of the rarest military honors in existence, caught the light. One of the veterans inhaled sharply at the sight. Caro didn't notice. He was circling closer. The psychological siege. Do you dream, Sergeant? Caro hissed, his words low now, meant only for Hayes and the nearest microphones. Do you wake up at night screaming? Do you think the world owes you reverence just because you stood very still on pretty white steps while better men actually fought? The veteran's eyes darkened like thunderclap. The press gallery froze, pens hovering mid-air. Caro leaned closer, his shadow falling across Hayes's boots. Or is this what you are now? He whispered. A hollow monument? A machine wearing a dead man's medals? For a flicker of an instant, a heartbeat so quick no one could be sure it happened. Hayes's jaw flexed. It was tiny, microscopic, but it was enough to make two of the veterans lean forward. Eyes blazing, the room had stopped breathing. Building toward breaking point, Caro smiled, sensing blood. There it is, he breathed, straightening with a grin. A crack. He spun toward the jury box, empty. This was only a hearing, but theater didn't require substance. You see, ladies and gentlemen, he can't even look at me. He hides behind ritual because reality terrifies him. Flash, flash, flash. The cameras fired like muzzle bursts. Hayes did not blink, did not move, did not surrender, but inside, his heart was a slow war drum. Ryan Cole's laugh echoed in his mind. The memory of a folded flag, the promise he whispered every morning, stand for them. Caro strode back to the bench, robes flaring, and slammed his palms on the wood. I will break this silence, he vowed to the room, or prove it was hollow all along. The crowd begins to fracture. Whispers began crawling through the crowd like wildfire. Why doesn't he say anything? Maybe he really can't. No, he's choosing this. The schoolchildren who had giggled earlier now sat frozen, wide-eyed. One clutched her friend's arm. In the press row, half the reporters had stopped writing entirely. The other half wrote faster than they ever had in their lives. The veterans were no longer seated. They stood like a wall, silent, arms folded, their stares burning into the judge's back. And still, in the center, Hayes stood unmoving, like the eye of a gathering storm. Caro's final push. Caro saw his window closing. He stormed down from the bench, robes trailing like smoke, and mounted the steps to the witness stand until he was only inches from Hayes. Answer me, he snarled, voice low and venomous. Look at me. Nothing. Speak. Nothing. Caro's face reddened, spit flying as he hissed. You disgrace every soldier. Who then stopped, because at that moment the room shifted. The veterans straightened as one. The press fell silent. Even the air seemed to hold its breath. Hayes's eyes, which had stared unblinking at the empty air 3 inches above Caro's head, slowly lowered until they locked directly. deliberately with the judges. It was not anger. It was not fear. It was something older, something carved in stone and grief and fire, and it made Caro flinch. A gasp rippled through the gallery. Camera shutters stuttered. A child whispered. He moved. It was the smallest motion imaginable, but it cracked the world open. Caro took a single instinctive step back, then caught himself. Snarling, he forced a laugh, brittle, too sharp. So, the statue moves after all, but no one laughed with him this time, because the room had changed sides, and everyone knew, even if they couldn't explain how, that something unstoppable had just awakened. The courtroom air had gone thin. Even the sound of the old ceiling fan seemed distant, like it was spinning in another world. Hayes stood motionless at the witness stand, the same stance he'd held since the hearing began, spine straight, boots rooted, rifle gleaming under the skylight like a frozen blade. Judge Victor Caro loomed before him, robes quivering, mouth twisted in a grin that had too many teeth, and he stepped closer. The line is crossed. Look at you, Caro muttered, low enough that only the first few rows and the nearest microphones could hear. A man pretending to be stone-hazed didn't move. Caro's grin hardened. You think this silence makes you strong? You think it makes you righteous? He leaned forward, so close his breath fogged against the rifle's chrome. It makes you pathetic. The word cracked through the air like a whip. Hayes didn't blink. Then, slowly, theatrically, Caro raised one finger and tapped it against the tomb guard's badge on Hayes's chest. Tap. A sound so small it barely existed, but the room detonated. Gasps tore from the gallery. One of the veterans swore aloud. A camera clattered to the floor. Because everyone in that room knew what that badge meant, and everyone knew what that touch meant. Caro had crossed the sacred line. Silence becomes a weapon. Hayes did not flinch. Not an inch. Not a breath. But the stillness around him became something else entirely. Not passive. Not frozen. Sharp, alive, electric. The veterans rose as one, a dozen boots scraping like a drumline. Their faces had gone iron-hard. Fists balled at their sides. The reporters froze mid-stroke, pens hovering. The school children sat like carved dolls, wide-eyed and pale. Caro tapped the badge again. Tap. Double quotes. Nothing. He hissed, voice like acid. Not even a flinch. Hayes's eyes, unblinking, fixed at parade height, didn't move. Caro's laugh was too loud, too high. It cracked around the edges. You're not a soldier. You're an actor. A toy soldier who forgot how to be human. He reached for the rifle, and that was when everything changed. The precision of discipline. Caro's fingertips had just brushed the polished barrel when Hayes moved. It wasn't fast. It wasn't violent. It was surgical. His left boot slid back a measured 6 inches, anchoring him. His right hand rose from his side in one clean, fluid arc, intercepting the judge's reaching hand without touching him, halting it mid-air by sheer proximity. It was the kind of motion that was less reaction and more ritual, a movement forged by thousands of hours of repetition until it was beyond thought. And then his head turned, a motion so slow it was almost invisible. His eyes, which had stared unwaveringly into the middle distance all this time, lowered with mechanical grace until they locked onto Caro's for the first time since this began. Sergeant Daniel Hayes looked at him. Not through him, not past him, at him, and Caro's grin died. The room holds its breath. Hayes spoke. One word. Sir. It was quiet. Too quiet. But it carried. Every ear in that courtroom heard it as if he'd whispered it directly to them. Caro jerked back like the word had burned. Hayes's voice followed, calm and level, stripped of everything except precision. Do not touch the rifle. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't anger. It was simply truth. The veterans stood taller, shoulders squaring, as if answering a command only they could hear. The schoolchildren clutched each other's arms. Caro tried to laugh, but it fractured into something brittle. You think you can give me orders? Hayes didn't answer. He didn't need to, because he hadn't moved Caro's hand. But Caro's hand had retreated all the same. The stillness rose for 5 long seconds. The two men stared at each other. Hayes, perfectly still, like marble given breath. Caro, trembling faintly, fury and fear wrestling behind his eyes. The silence became deafening. Every creak of the building, every scuff of a shoe, every shallow inhale was suddenly amplified into thunder. And then Hayes did something so small it made the world tilt. He shifted the rifle a 1/4 inch turn. A correction so microscopic it was almost nothing, but it was flawless. It was ceremonial. It was the same motion used on the white marble steps of Arlington when tomb guards change shifts. The motion that marks precision, honor, and vigilance. Click. The rifles but tapped the floor like a gavel. The sound shot through the courtroom like lightning. A reporter gasped. A child whispered, "He's alive." The judge breaks. Caro stumbled back a step. Just one. But the spell shattered. He blinked wildly, eyes darting between Hayes's motionless frame and the silent gallery. Everyone was watching. No one was on his side anymore. "This is contempt," Caro barked, voice cracking. This is a stunt. "He's mocking this court, sir," Hayes said again, and the words sliced through Caro's rant like a blade. "Protocol is not mockery. Discipline is not defiance." He paused, eyes unblinking, voice flat as polished steel. "It is remembrance." Something in the veterans broke then, not loudly, not visibly, but their eyes flooded. One reached into his pocket and held up his dog tags like a salute. Another simply mouthed, "Thank you." Caro's voice faltered. He glanced toward the bailiffs, but they were frozen too. Wide-eyed. He was alone. The absolute silence. Hayes returned his gaze to parade height, the air above Caro's head, and locked there, motionless again, silent again. But the silence wasn't weakness anymore. It was dominance. It was absolute, a silence so powerful it bent the entire room around it. Cameras flashed. No one moved. No one breathed. Even the old ceiling fan seemed to stop spinning. Caro's lips parted, but no sound came out. The words had abandoned him, for the first time in his career. The judge, the man who wielded words like weapons, had nothing left, because a single soldier had dismantled him without ever raising his voice, or taking a single step. The world reacts. The first sound back was a sob. One of the schoolchildren, the youngest girl, buried her face in her hands, shoulders shaking. Her teacher wrapped an arm around her, whispering, "It's okay. He's okay." The reporters exploded back to life, pens scratching like wildfire, flash, flash, flash. Every angle, every fraction of Hayes's face, every detail of his stillness was being devoured by their cameras. The veterans saluted as one. Caro sagged against the bench, pale and trembling, hands shaking as they clutched the wood. Hayes didn't look at him again. Didn't need to, because everyone in that chamber, from the smallest child to the oldest veteran, had seen the balance of power shift, not through force, not through volume, through something older, through honor. The moment crystallizes. Hayes breathed in. Once, slow, silent, then resumed the exact same stance he'd held from the start. Spine straight, boots rooted, eyes forward, still. As if the storm had passed through him and left not a single mark. And somehow, that made it louder. Caro sank back into his chair. Robes, limp eyes, hollow. He had touched the untouchable, and the untouchable had moved. Not to attack, not to fight. To remind the world what cannot be broken. The courtroom stood frozen in stunned silence. Judge Halcroft's face was pale, his lips trembling as the echo of his fallen gavel faded into nothing. The guard had not struck him, had not even touched him, and yet, the entire balance of power in that room had shifted in an instant. The courtroom no longer belonged to the judge, or the lawyers, or the spectators. It belonged to the silence. It belonged to the guard. Halcroft's robes were askew from his stumble backward. The mahogany bench loomed above him like a gallows. He scrambled to gather his papers, but his fingers shook violently, scattering them across the floor like frightened birds. Gasps rose from the gallery as the first veteran in the back, the one with trembling hands and an old army pin on his lapel, stepped forward and saluted. Cameras clicked like distant thunder. Reporters who moments ago had laughed now stood with jaws slack, notepads forgotten. One slowly lowered her camera and whispered, "My God." The guard had returned to perfect stillness, as if nothing had happened. The only sign of movement was the faint flutter of the ceremonial cord on his shoulder from the draft. His chin lifted a fraction of an inch, not in pride, not in anger, in duty. Then a voice cut through the tension, sharp as a bayonet. "Your Honor," barked the bailiff, storming in from the side door. "The Oversight Committee is here." Halcroft's eyes widened. The double doors at the rear of the courtroom opened, and a small delegation strode in. The Chief Justice of the Military Court, a 2-star general, and the Secretary of the Army. Their faces were grim, carved from stone. The general's uniform gleamed with rows of campaign ribbons. They had come unannounced. They had seen everything. The general spoke first, voice low but thunderous. "This court has been in contempt of honor." Halcroft stammered. I was merely." "You mocked a sentinel," the general cut in, words slicing like a blade. "One who stands guard over our dead. You called him a statue. You tried to break him." He stepped closer, but he did not break. "You did." The courtroom trembled in silence. Even the ticking wall clock seemed to hold its breath. The Secretary of the Army raised a hand. "Effective immediately," she said coldly. Judge Halcroft is relieved of duty, pending a full investigation into his conduct and behavior unbecoming of a federal officer. The words hit like cannon fire. The bailiff stepped forward, removing Halcroft's gavel and security badge. The judge sagged into his chair as if the life had been drained out of him. Cameras exploded in blinding bursts of light. Every reporter in the room was now standing, furiously scribbling. Then, without a word, the guard did something that made every soul in the room tremble. He lifted his right hand, slowly, deliberately, and rendered a flawless salute, not to the judge, not to the press, but to the empty air above the courtroom, the silent memory of those he stood for. The veterans in the gallery rose as one, saluting back. Even the general's voice cracked as he joined them. The hush in that courtroom was cathedral deep. Halcroft watched from behind watery eyes as his authority, once absolute, dissolved into nothing. He had sought to humiliate a man of duty, and had ended up exposing his own smallness before the entire world. The guard lowered his hand, without glancing at anyone, without a word. He pivoted on his heel with razor precision, a single sharp click echoing on the marble floor, and marched out. Click, click, click. Each step reverberated like the beat of a distant drum, like the heartbeat of history itself. Reporters swarmed after him, their voices colliding in a storm of questions, but none reached him. He did not hear, he did not turn, because this moment was not his. It belonged to the tomb, to the promise. Behind him, Judge Halcroft sat alone on his bench, stripped of the arrogance that once cloaked him. His head hung low as the veterans filed past, some shaking their heads, others staring with silent disdain. One old Marine paused, leaned close, and whispered, "You never understood. Honor doesn't flinch." Then he left Halcroft to the ruins of his pride. And in the hallway, just beyond the courthouse doors, the guard stopped for the briefest second. He reached under his collar and touched a small, worn dog tag hidden there, his fallen friend's name etched in fading steel. A storm of camera flashes burst around him, but he kept walking, back to his post. Back to the silence, back to eternity. Rain had started to fall as the guard walked across the marble steps of the courthouse. Thin silver lines streaked down from the gray sky, beating on the brim of his cap, running down the polish of his boots. Reporters still lingered outside, clustered behind barricades, their cameras held low now, not daring to break the strange, solemn stillness that followed him like a shadow. He didn't look at them. He didn't look at anyone. His gaze was fixed forward, as if he could already see the eternal flame burning miles away, calling him back. Behind him, the courthouse doors creaked open and a slow shuffle of footsteps followed. A soft voice spoke. "Soldier." He stopped, turned. Colonel Whitaker stood there, older now, his shoulders slightly stooped but his eyes as sharp as ever. A combat ribbon clung to his chest like a scar from another life. He had trained the guard years ago, back when he was just a silent young recruit standing in the rain on the parade grounds, learning how to hold still while the world moved. The colonel came to attention and saluted. The guard froze for a fraction of a second, eyes flicking with something unspoken. Then, with perfect precision, he returned the salute. Their hands dropped in unison, and for a moment, no words were needed. "You didn't just stand your ground in there," the colonel said quietly. "You reminded them why the ground matters." The guard said nothing. He only nodded once, and then something small tugged at the edge of his vision. A child standing beside her mother near the barricade. She couldn't have been older than 8. A small flag clutched in her fist. Rain soaked her hair into tiny strands across her forehead. She was staring at him the way someone might stare at a star. As he passed, she leaned toward her mother and whispered, barely audible over the hush of the rain, "He's a hero." The word landed like a weight on his shoulders, not heavy, but steady. Like the weight of a promise, he walked on, each step measured, each breath quiet. His hand drifted to his chest where, beneath the uniform layers, a tiny pocket held a folded note, the last thing his best friend had ever written before falling in a faraway war zone. The paper was worn soft as cloth now from years of being carried. He didn't need to read it. He knew every word. "If I don't make it back, stand for me." As the guard reached the edge of the plaza, a soft golden light broke through the clouds. It fell across the slick stone and glimmered against the rainwater like tears on marble. A car waited to return him to Arlington. The photographers finally lifted their cameras, expecting him to turn, to pose, to say something dramatic. He didn't. He only placed his cap back on his head, squared his shoulders, and stepped inside the vehicle without a word. As the door closed, the world outside seemed to fade. The courthouse, the chaos, the storm. Because in his mind, he was already there again, walking the black mat at the tomb of the unknown soldier, each footfall striking with absolute precision. rifle balanced, gaze unbroken, guarding not just the dead, but the very idea of duty itself. Asterisk, the footage from that courtroom traveled faster than any verdict ever could. By nightfall, it was everywhere across news channels, stitched into reels, replayed in silent awe on countless screens. Yet it wasn't the chaos or the scandal that people remembered. It was the stillness, the way one man had stood when everything else crumbled, the way silence had roared louder than any argument, the way honor had refused to bow. Commentators argued, politicians spun it, but none of it mattered, because somewhere in every person who watched that moment, something ancient stirred, a memory of what integrity once looked like. No speeches, no grand theatrics, just a man who refused to move, because some things are not his to abandon. Days later, the courtroom sat empty, its benches collecting dust. But, at Arlington, the mat was freshly blackened again, boots striking in measured cadence. The guard had returned to his post as if nothing had happened, because to him nothing had. The world had shifted, but his duty had not. He would not write a book. He would not give interviews. He would not profit from the moment that shattered a judge and silenced a nation. He would simply stand for them, for always and maybe, in a world addicted to noise. That was the most defiant act of all. If this moment reached you, if you felt that flicker of stillness in your own chest, then share this story. Not for views, but for remembrance. Because tradition is not weakness. Stillness is strength, and silence can echo forever. Honor them. Subscribe, share, and carry the legacy forward.